Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction and the warm welcome. Lovely to be here with you today. So I'm nearly a little bit nervous. This is my first in-person conference for 2.5 years, good 2.5 years. So I've had the opportunity to give plenty of online talks, even at last year's product elevation, but yeah, first time back in person. So this feels all new. Right, product strategy, that's the topic of my talk today. So I'm looking forward to discussing strategizing with you and particularly sharing some tips on how you can maybe get your strategy right. Product strategy, I find, is a very important plan, you could maybe say, artifact for us as product people, but yeah, getting it right is not always easy. But before I share those tips with you, I'd like to briefly say what I believe a product strategy is, what I mean by the term product strategy, and why a strategy might be important. Now it's November, and November, the days are getting shorter, they're getting colder, the weather's turning bad, it's rainy, certainly it's been rainy quite a bit in the UK where I'm based. And so this time of year I always start thinking about, wouldn't it be nice to enjoy some sun again? And where could we go for our next summer holiday? So when I say we, I mean my family and I. Now, this year we were fortunate enough, it's working now, to spend some time at this area in southern Bavaria. So that's right in the south of Germany, close to the Austrian border. It's called Tegernsee, and Tegernsee is also the name of the lake that you can see here on this photo. Now, it's an area I'm very fond of. I really enjoy being in. You can swim in the lake. You can sail across the lake if you have a sailing boat, or you can row across it if you hire a rowing boat. You can take even a ferry across the lake. You can go for walks along the lake. You can go for hikes in the mountains. And you can go for bicycle rides in the mountains and around the lake. And this picture was taken at the beginning of a little ride I went on. So as you can tell, I do like the area. And assuming because we had such a wonderful time there, and we did have a good time, we decided to go back, then, before I get overly excited now and start thinking about route choices, or how long is it going to take us to drive there, and should I book a hotel or not, and should we take the ferry to get across to France from the UK, or rather take the train, the shuttle, I think it's a good idea to think about my strategic options. And so if I go on Google Maps, for instance, or use another mapping tool, then there are three main options, you could say, strategies that the tool here, Google Maps, is suggesting. So we could drive, we could fly, we could take the train, we could maybe even cycle. That might be the most environmentally friendly option. So again, just like any journey we plan, any holiday we plan, I think the first thing before we get excited and worry about the details, worry about, as I said, booking a ferry or the shuttle, or breaking up the journey, or should we fly to Innsbruck, should we fly to Munich, and do we need to hire a car? It's good to choose the strategy, the mode of transportation. And I would suggest that we do the same thing for our products. So what is a product strategy, or at least what is my definition of a product strategy? For me, it's a high-level plan that essentially summarizes our approach to make or keep the product successful. So how do we want to achieve a product success? What value do we want to create, and how do we want to create that value? Now, why is a strategy important in a product management context? For me, strategy guides execution. So that's ultimately the purpose of the strategizing effort. When we develop products, when we develop digital products, I think we have to pay a lot of attention to the details. But if we don't have a big picture, if we don't have an overarching plan that guides us, then it's really easy to be lost in the details. And so this is where the strategy comes in. It's impossible for me to write the right user stories, to give you an example, if we don't know who the users are and why people would want to use the product in the first place, right? I mean, otherwise this is just pure speculation, and we might end up writing the right user stories or maybe the wrong ones, who knows? So yeah, strategy guides execution. It helps us determine the right user experience, the right features, and it helps development teams make the right technology decisions. And then finally, as you're probably aware of anyway, there are different types of strategies. There's a business strategy, there's a product portfolio strategy, then there are technology strategies, there's an innovation strategy, so there are various strategies that we can distinguish, but I very much focus on product strategy in my talk today. So, if strategy now is important, but if it's not always easy to practice a strategy effectively, then what can help us to get it right? Well, I would suggest that there are 5 qualities that an effective strategy has. The first one is it should be outcome-based. And I guess that's a term you've heard before today, probably not only today, but I think in product management we've talked about outcomes and benefits or outcome-based goals quite a bit in recent years, and for very good reason. So I think using outcomes can be very beneficial when it comes to a product strategy. The second quality I would suggest is it should be connected. So I don't think it's helpful to look at product strategy in an isolated fashion without taking into account its relation to other product management planning artifacts. The third quality is it should be validated. It should be not only based on past experience, gut feeling, or the highest paid person opinions, or whatever the big boss thinks is right, but it should be based on empirical evidence, on data. So we should be confident that what we describe in our strategy is likely to result in a successful product. The fourth quality is adaptive. It'd be a mistake to think, well, we create the strategy once and then all we need to do is execute. Thank God, we're done. We're done with all this strategy work, unfortunately. Or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I don't think that's how it works. So we need to regularly inspect and adapt our strategy. And then the fifth quality I would suggest is that it's collaborative, that we involve the right people in creating, validating, and then reviewing and updating the strategy so that we not only use our own knowledge and our own expertise, but we draw on the expertise and knowledge of a larger, more diverse group of people. And so for me, these 5 qualities are helpful in order, I should maybe backtrack and say these 5 qualities are helpful no matter which specific processes or strategy models or frameworks, approaches, tools and templates you use. And for me, whenever you practice strategy, it's useful to consider making sure that these qualities, these attributes are fulfilled. Having said that, I'd like to spend the rest of my talk now detailing those qualities and showing you how you can apply them and how they can help you, creating an effective strategy. And the first one I'd like to start with is outcome-based and connected. And in order to do so, I'd like to introduce the strategy model that I've developed to you, starting with, the product strategy. And as I've suggested before, the strategy describes the approach that we've chosen in order to achieve product success. But I've introduced something else here to realize the vision. So in my mind, the strategy is connected in a meaningful way, or should be connected in a meaningful way to an overarching vision, product vision, something I'll say a few more words about shortly. But before I do that, I'd like to talk about outcomes, and I'd like to talk about the key elements that a product strategy should offer. The first one for me is the needs that we want to address, the user and customer needs. And that's also an outcome. So the outcomes I've tried to mark in bold here on this slide, very cunningly. So yes, the needs that we want to address, the user customer needs, the reason for people to engage with our product. So to make this a little bit more specific, I don't know if it was big news here in Ireland, but last week in the UK, the fact that the number of people suffering from diabetes 2 is growing was in the news again. So maybe it would make sense to offer a product that helps people reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Then that could exactly be the need. So the need that my product addresses is help people reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So what is the specific problem that we'd like to address? What is the tangible benefit that we want to offer with our product? So I think that's something that an effective strategy should capture. The next element, second, is the market segment or the target group, the beneficiaries of our product. So who are the users and who are the customers, assuming there are people who will pay for the product in one way or another? And so in my case, I might choose to target middle-aged men like myself, for instance, who would benefit from having a product that helps them reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, maybe because our eating habits are unhealthy, or maybe because we just enjoy eating and drinking too much, whatever it might be. Yeah? Standout features are those qualities of the product that set it apart from competing offerings and encourage people to choose it over alternatives. So I could think about something like maybe seamless integration with leading smart scales and smartwatches for my healthy eating app, and personalized recommendations, personalized eating recommendations, obviously built with the latest machine learning technologies. And then business goals, finally, that's the second outcome here, would be the benefits that the product should offer for the company developing and providing it. Now, that might be generating revenue. It might be, once the product has achieved product market fit, hitting a specific profit margin, a specific profit target, or it might be about reducing cost, increasing productivity, developing the brand and increasing brand equity, or possibly a combination thereof. Yeah, but what is the tangible benefit for the business, and why should the company invest or continue to invest in this product? So for me, these are 4 elements that I would be looking for in any form of product strategy that I think are worthwhile calling out and describing. And that essentially, for me, make up the essence, the heart of a product strategy. Now, what about then the connection of a strategy? When the first connection I'd like to explore with you is the vision. So for me, the strategy describes our approach, or the approach chosen to realize the vision, or at least make progress towards the vision. And the vision itself states the ultimate reason for creating the product, the positive change it should bring about. So I've mentioned this diabetes type product. What could be a vision for this product? Maybe help people eat more healthily, or just healthy eating. So short and sweet. So I like to work just with a simple vision statement. I like to keep it short and sweet so that it's memorable, and try and find a vision that is hopefully somewhat inspiring. So it creates some pull, some hopefully fundamental alignment for the stakeholders and development teams. But for me, the vision is a big overarching aspirational goal. So it's not something that can be measured, and it may never be fully realized. And for me personally, that's perfectly okay, because it's more like the North Star that we're following rather than a specific measurable goal. Yeah. And so, yeah, I like to usually start with the vision, and then based on the vision, think about what seems to be a viable strategy to move closer towards that vision. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the key reasons for using a product strategy is that the strategy can guide execution. But I don't see any execution or delivery or development related elements on this slide. So, the question then is, how can the strategy help and guide execution? Where's the product backlog, and where are the product backlog items? Where are those user stories? Well, the answer for me is, it shows you I don't have my own slides. So in case you're stuck you're looking for a template or a structure in order to capture your vision and your product strategy, there's a little template I developed, I think about 10 years ago, and I named it a product vision board. So you can use that, you can try that out and download it for free from my website. But what I really wanted to get to is the product roadmap. And I know we had a product roadmap talk earlier today, which I unfortunately missed, I must admit. But for me, the product roadmap very much kind of works in tandem, in combination with a product strategy. So in this model here, the product roadmap essentially communicates how the strategy will be implemented. And this is done by offering a number of key pieces of information. The most important one is the first one, by stating product goals. And product goals are outcomes. So they're the specific benefits, the specific pieces of value that the product should offer over the coming months. So, for my healthy eating product, I might decide that an initial product goal might be to acquire initial user base and help people understand some of their eating habits. And then a subsequent product goal might be to retain people by helping them improve some of their eating habits. So essentially, what I'm doing here is I'm tying together the product roadmap with the product strategy by either translating needs and business goals directly into product goals, or at least making sure that any product goals, any outcomes on my product roadmap are in line with the needs and business goals stated in my strategy. There are a few other elements on there that I should probably mention: dates or timeframes. Some of you might slightly cringe when they hear dates or timeframes in the context of a product roadmap. So it's been a hotly debated topic in product management over the past few years, if there should be dates and timeframes on a roadmap. My answer is, if you work with, or my take on this is, if you work with an internal private roadmap that is not shown to your customers, that it really serves to guide and align stakeholders and development teams. I'm quite happy with putting specific timeframes and even dates on roadmaps, but if you work with an external public roadmap, so to speak, I would not add any dates. And if you use timeframes, then Jana's developed a nice little model, the now, next, later framework. Then maybe use that. Yeah, Jana Basto's now, next, later framework for external roadmaps. Selected coarse-grained features are just pieces of output that sketch what the solution might possibly look like, but my recommendation is, if you use them, then keep them really big and coarse-grained, no epics, no user stories, no details. You'd like to avoid an overlap with the product backlog, but keep those plans distinct. And then I like to add some metrics, some success criteria that help me understand if a product goal has been met or not. Yeah. And so by deriving product goals from the needs and business goals, or at least ensuring that they are in line with the needs and business goals in the strategy, and by then taking the next product goal and copying it into the product backlog, I get that connection from the strategy to product backlog items. So historically, the product backlog describes the outstanding work required in order to create or evolve, progress a product. So you have pieces of functionality in there, maybe some UX related aspects of your product, things like epics and user stories for end user facing products, or possibly workflow diagrams, or sketches, mockups, and non-functional requirements. And so, what I recommend, and what the latest version of the Scrum Guide suggests, in case you're familiar with it, is that you focus your product backlog on a specific product goal. And again, the way I do it is I take the next goal from the product roadmap, copy it into the backlog, remove all product backlog items that do not help to meet this goal. So let me repeat this. Delete all the items that do not help meet this goal. Erase them or archive them. Yeah. So sometimes that takes a bit of courage. And then copy across the features. If I use features on my roadmap, think about additional big capabilities I need to introduce, start breaking some of them down into epics, prioritize the backlog, and refine the high priority items. Job done. You should be then ready to start the sprint, the next sprint, the upcoming sprint, and you should still have a nice and focused, concise backlog. So a big mistake I've seen people make again and again over the years is work with huge backlogs that are way too big to really manage in a meaningful way, way too big to prioritize, very unwieldy, and by having a goal-directed backlog that solves that number one challenge. So that's the model that I like to work with, and there's another little template here that you can use if you're looking for a way how you can capture a goal-oriented, outcome-based roadmap. But again, the key message here is make sure your product strategy is tied in a meaningful way to a vision, and I should have maybe said that earlier and made it explicit. I do like to distinguish between a vision and a strategy. So I think in a talk earlier this morning, it seemed to me that those two concepts were mixed up. That's cool as well, but it's just important that you understand what you mean by vision. So sometimes when people talk about a vision, they also mean a needs, market, and business goals, standout features. I like to keep the two things separate, and I'll illustrate why shortly. So yeah, connect your strategy to a vision, or think about how it's connected to a vision, and think about how your strategy then guides the product roadmap, relates to a product roadmap, and guides the product backlog and the detailed, the tactical product decisions. And the maybe two most important aspects of any product strategy are the needs and the business goals, so the value the product creates for the users and customers, and the value your product should create for the company developing and providing it. I wanted to take questions at the end, but would be now a good time to take questions? Yeah? Is that okay also for the people who are joining us online? Are there any questions at this stage?
Hello. I see you've got UX design coming in quite far down the line. And I guess, how does it work if you get feedback at that stage that stuff isn't working when they're testing with clients or customers, and you need to kind of go in and adjust strategy and kind of make changes? I guess, how would you approach something like that?
Yeah, UX design is unimportant. Sorry.
That's okay. You can probably tell I'm coming from a UX team, so.
Is my mic working? Yeah, now it's working again. So I think it kind of leads on to the next slide. I think what you're asking about is how do we make sure that we use the right UX approach? And you could ask the same thing about the technology. When do we select and where do we select? Say if this should be a layered architecture, if this should be a service-oriented architecture. The answer is at an early stage here, at least part of the answer, by validating the product strategy. And that's exactly what I wanted to talk about on the next slide. So thank you for your question. As it seems to be the only one right now, I'll move on. This is the third quality. So there were 5, just to remind you. This is the third one, validated. Now, it's cool to have confidence in drawing up who you believe the users and customers of your product are, what the value proposition is, what the standout features are, and what the business goals are. But how do you know that the pieces of information that you've captured are actually correct? So is it just gut feeling? Is it past experience? Is it a hunch? Is it because your boss tells you so? Or a senior stakeholder or a group of senior stakeholders have said, this is the strategy that we need? So for me, it's very useful to test our ideas, our strategic ideas, and literally put our strategy to the test, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. And initially, I'd like to introduce a process to do that. So in order to be able to test out our strategy, to validate it, we need, obviously, an initial, good enough, testable draft strategy. So while I think we'd like to minimize, generally speaking, the upfront discovery and market research efforts that we put in, I think we have to do just enough so we can say who the users, customers are, and so forth, and describe our strategy in sufficient detail and with enough, in sufficient detail, and be specific enough so that we can actually test it, that we can actually recognize key assumptions and spot key risks. Yeah? So this is how this process works, which is roughly based on Eric Ries's Build, Measure, Learn, described in his book Lean Startup. So you start with an initial good enough testable product strategy, and then that'd be my recommendation, think about where's the biggest risk. What risk, what piece of uncertainty do we have to address right now in order to avoid making the wrong product decisions? And that might be around the target group. So I might not be 100% sure that middle-aged men for my new healthy eating product really is the right target group. Maybe it would be better to go for teenagers, right? Teenagers are maybe more open to follow through recommendations made by digital products, possibly. Or maybe it's something I need to test out and find out. So that's then something to do, and I could then determine the right validation method and think about maybe I'll interview people, maybe I'll do direct observation, maybe I'll run some surveys. Yeah? Or maybe it's about the ability to make personalized recommendations and being able to use an appropriate machine learning technology. So then obviously the validation method would look very differently, and I'd maybe choose building a throwaway prototype instead. Yeah? So once I've identified the risk, the biggest uncertainty that is currently present in my strategy, by essentially looking at the statements, at what I've written down, I can then determine the right validation method. I can then apply it and collect the relevant data, and I can then evaluate, analyze that data, and think about what to do next. And the 3 choices that you have at this stage, you've already heard today. I think that was in Coco's talk. So the first one would be to say, well, the data looks good, the feedback looks good. It seems that our strategy is at least roughly right. We just maybe need to adjust now the target group, or we need to fine-tune the value proposition, or maybe one of the standout features. And that would be then a persevere in lean startup speak. So, all we need to do is make a refinement, an incremental improvement to our strategy. The next choice is to say, oh boy, that strategy didn't work out. It was wrong. Oh dear. And then we'd consider pivoting. And so, for my healthy eating product, if I find out that there are already loads of digital products out there that want to help people eat more healthily, well, maybe I could think about what? Writing a book or running healthy eating workshops. Those would be alternative strategies, but my vision would still stay the same. So I'd still have the vision of helping people eat more healthily. And that's one of the reasons why I like to differentiate between the vision and the product strategy. So it gives you the opportunity to pivot, to stay grounded in your vision, but change your approach towards realizing it. And then the third option would be to cancel the innovation initiative or to kill it right there, right then. And that's something you should consider doing once you've pivoted once or twice, but the new strategy still doesn't seem to be working. So, or is unlikely to work out, unlikely to result in a successful product. And so a pivot and a kill are examples of failure experiences. And it's important for me to point this out. Failing, and I think it's something that James also alluded to in his lightning talk earlier, are part and parcel of bringing something new to life, be it a new product, be it new features. It's a very common experience for us as product people. However, from personal experience, I know that failing can be challenging for two reasons. The first one is, if I think of myself as an expert, as the product expert, as the person who should really know best what's right for the users and for the customers, and then I come up with an initial strategy and it turns out actually it's pretty wrong, that can be hard to swallow. It can go against the view I have of myself, how I view myself. And then the second thing is, it can also go against organizational habits. I personally had never a boss who said to me, Roman, I want you to fail a little bit more. And now, being my own boss and having been my own boss for quite a few years, I still sometimes kind of struggle with, having the courage just to try something out and go for it. So, it's easy to say failure is part and parcel of innovation, but it's sometimes kind of challenging to see it through or experience it. So if that's the case for you, then you're in good company, I'd say. Happens to most of us. So hopefully we'll find a way to make this strategy work and end up, once we've iterated over this strategy a few times, with a validated product strategy. So you start with an initial good enough sketchy draft strategy. You identify the biggest risk or the biggest assumption. You then think about how you address it, collect the relevant data, improve your strategy, and you go through this circle. You iterate over your strategy until no significant risks are left, or no significant assumptions are left, or you've run out of time and money. Now, we've got a validated product strategy. Let's assume that. That's good. But what does it actually mean? What does it mean to have a validated strategy? Well, for me, it means that we've now maximized our chance that it is very likely that implementing the strategy is likely to result in a successful product. And a successful product can be characterized as a product that is desirable. So there is a need for it, and a strong enough need for it, and enough people have this need, right? So, the risk to reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes is strong enough for a big enough group of middle-aged men like myself. And I've shown this, I've got data to show this, right? So it's desirable. And there's also a way to make that product work for the target audience. And this is where user experience aspects for me come in, where this process, this validation process, may well require that I start looking into maybe not the detailed user experience design, but some key user journeys or some key ways of allowing people to interact with the product and doing a little bit of UX concept work. It's feasible from a technical perspective. We're in a position to develop and provide this product, make it accessible to people. So this is where some work around technology and architecture comes in, and where maybe building a spike, a throwaway prototype can be useful. It's viable, so there's a business model that supports this product, and that's particularly important for revenue generating product. So it can be monetized, and I've shown that this business model is likely to work, that, for instance, the right customer relationship can be established, or if I need any partners and suppliers, that I've got the right people, I've found the right people, the right companies to work with. And ethical finally means that my product doesn't cause any harm, or this strategy is likely to result in a product that doesn't cause any harm. And I would suggest that we'd like our products to truly be beneficial for our users and customers. But I think the least we should aim for as product people is a product that doesn't cause harm to the users. So it doesn't, for instance, encourage addictive behavior, and doesn't cause harm to the society and the planet as a whole, right? Think about the impact on climate change, for instance, of our products. And then the final aspect of ethical is that it's developed in such a way that is conducive to sustainable pace, so that the people who design and develop the product can do so without sacrificing their mental well-being. So for me, that's something that's become an increasing concern over the past few years. And so, I find it's important to point it out. So ideally, we've got our initial strategy. We've now iterated over that strategy, and we've shown that it's likely to result in a product with those 4 qualities. So that means validated. And that can be a bit of work. It might only be half a day or a day if what we're doing is not significantly innovative, or it's not a big change to what we've done before. But it might be a few weeks. It might even be a few months if there's a lot of innovation, if there's a lot of uncertainty. So if you're not sure how long it's going to take you to validate an initial strategy, my suggestion is time box it. And time box it to a maximum of 1 month, and have weekly review sessions where you review your progress in validating the strategy. And so that say every Friday you look back and say, this is what we've achieved this week. This is all the risks that we've addressed, the open points, assumptions that we've successfully validated. And do we need to do more validation work, or can we actually now stop with the validation and strategizing work and derive a roadmap and then start building this product? So that's the idea of validating your product and having a validated strategy. The next one is adaptive. And so I mentioned this earlier. It'd be a mistake to think we've got now our validated strategy. Thank God for that. That was enough work. Now all we need to do is execute it. Because obviously the strategy is just a plan that's based on the knowledge that we have at a certain point in time, but markets change, customer and user expectations change as well. And so it's important to regularly review and update the strategy. In many ways, you could say the whole point of strategizing work is to be proactive and be responsive rather than reactive. So, you'd like to avoid, I would suggest, being caught out and finding yourselves with your backs against the wall in some form of emergency, or maybe even crises, and, discovering all of a sudden that a competitor has leapfrogged you and launched a new product, or is offering a new killer feature, and you just didn't see it coming at all. So having an adaptive strategy allows you to be proactive, hopefully. So what are the factors that help you to adapt your strategy, and what are the factors that help you to be proactive and responsive? I would suggest the most important one are the key performance indicators, KPIs, that you use. What are KPIs? What are key performance indicators? Well, those are key metrics that measure the value that your product is creating. So how much value is your product creating? How good a job is your product doing for the users, customers, and for the business? Now, where do those KPIs come from? If you remember the model I introduced earlier to you, there were 2 key outcomes, needs and business goals. And those are major sources for discovering the appropriate KPIs, the appropriate key performance indicators I would recommend. So think about the needs that your product should address and think about the business goals that it should offer. And based on those, ask yourselves, well, how can we measure that we're making progress towards those goals, that we're achieving those outcomes? And that should then help you choose your initial set of KPIs. And maybe I should say, KPIs, something like engagement, retention, conversion, monthly recurring revenue, cost. So those are all sample indicators. And then you may also remember that I talked briefly about product goals and the idea of including metrics on your roadmap. So if that's what you do, then you can copy your roadmap metrics into your set of KPIs. So that makes it fairly complete. And then in addition to those two sources, I'd also think about including a few what I call health indicators, metrics that help you understand how motivated and healthy your team is. The product probably isn't very motivated. How healthy and motivated your team is and how healthy your product is. Yeah? So you can measure team happiness or healthiness in terms of looking at how sustainable pace is practiced, or if your team practices sustainable pace, if people don't work excessive extra hours, if people aren't permanently stressed. Things like sickness leave days and turnover rates can help you with this. And for your product, it's the number of open bugs and code complexity or of architecture refactoring potential that help you understand how soft is the software and how much spaghetti code do you have. Again, I find it helpful to add those indicators to your set of KPIs. They're typically leading indicators. So if team motivation is down or if software quality is down, no matter how much your users and customers love the product and no matter how much money you're making at the moment, you're likely to experience difficult times in the near future. So use your KPIs, and if your KPIs indicate that the trends are negative, that revenue is going down, engagement is going down, retention is going down, then obviously there's something not quite right either with your strategy. It's no longer valid and you have to adjust it, or there's something not quite right with the way you implement the strategy. The second factor that helps you understand if your strategy is still helpful are trends, regularly looking at trends, consumer, technology, and legal trends. So think about the current cost of living crisis that we're experiencing and the squeeze that many people feel. That could have an impact on your product, so it's probably worthwhile asking, is it likely to have an impact? And if so, are there any threats here? Are there any opportunities here? Should we respond to it in a way? Technology trends, I've mentioned machine learning. What else is there? Internet of Things. Microservices is probably too old to be a trend these days, right? But again, I do think it's important to think about what's happening from a technology perspective, and is there something that we can take advantage of that can maybe give us an edge in the future? And then legal trends will depend on the product that you look after in the industry you're in. So typically, particularly important in industries such as healthcare or finance or aviation. But when you think back to GDPR, then I think affected virtually all digital products. So again, watch out for trends and see if they offer opportunities or if they threaten your product. What's the competition doing? Are there any new competitors that have entered the market? Are established competitors leaving? Are competitors offering new products or new features? And if so, should you respond to those developments? And if so, in which way? And what's the impact on your strategy? Are there any significant product roadmap changes? Do the outcomes, the goals on your product roadmaps, have they changed, or have any of the timelines changed significantly? That might indicate that you have to adjust your strategy. And then finally, if your business and product portfolio strategy change, then usually that means you also have to update your product strategy. So there's a knock-on effect. The business strategy describes the approach to make the entire enterprise successful, and the portfolio strategy does the same thing for the product portfolio, a group of related products that your product may belong to. And as your product is a value-creating vehicle, it serves to create value for the users and customers and for the business, and implement the business and portfolio strategy. Again, if those two strategies change, I'd expect a knock-on effect on your product strategy. So use those 5 factors, that's my advice, in order to regularly review and adapt your strategy. Now, how often is regularly? So I suggest the sort of a dual approach. I would recommend that you make time at least once a week to look at least some of the data that I've shown here. So some of the KPI related data, some of the data that your key performance indicators ultimately collect, may be available on a daily or at least a weekly basis. So look at that data once a week. Similarly with trends and trends and competition developments, it's probably something you want to keep an eye on, once a week or so. So set aside a few hours, half a day a week, in order to look at data, KPI data, trends and competition data that's coming in, and see what you can learn from it and see if you need to respond to it. And in addition to that, I would recommend that once a quarter you schedule a bigger strategy review, where you also look at the product roadmap and you see if both plans are up to date, you keep them in sync, and you bring the right people on board to help you go through this review and make the right product decisions. So a weekly review cycle and then a quarterly review cycle. That's what I would recommend. Now, I've already mentioned bringing the right people on board in order to review the strategy. And that brings me to the last quality I wanted to discuss with you. For me, an effective product strategy has to be collaborative. As product people, it's difficult for us to know everything, right? I mean, it's difficult to know about the users and customers in the market, the competition. It's difficult to know about the business model, and it gets even trickier than to be an expert in user experience design and the technologies and knows about how to craft the right marketing and sales strategy. So at some point in time, I do think we benefit from having some support. And so in order to make the right decisions, in order to make the right strategic decisions for our product, I think it's good to bring those experts together, bring the right people together. And now, who are those right people? So for me, of course, it's the person in charge of the product manager or Scrum product owner. I would also suggest inviting development team members. So if you work with multiple development teams, then those would be representatives from those teams. Ask the teams to send people to help you with strategic product decisions. Why would it be beneficial to have development team members here? Well, because they hopefully have the right technology and architecture knowledge and the right user experience design knowledge, assuming that you have your user experience people working as part of the development teams. So they offer that knowledge and help you understand, for instance, what the UX impact is of product decisions, or if some of the strategic ideas you have are technologically feasible or how challenging they are. And then I suggest inviting the key stakeholders. So for a commercial revenue generating product, that might be a marketeer or a sales rep or somebody from support, maybe also somebody from finance. So who the key stakeholders are will very much depend on your product and the organization that you work in. But the key word here is key stakeholder. The key word is key. So it'd probably not be helpful to invite all the stakeholders to a strategizing session. And I should say my preference is to run collaborative strategy workshops. So again, I think this is at least the second time you're hearing somebody today recommend using a collaborative workshop. So yeah, use a collaborative strategizing workshop, be it on site or be it online, but so that people hear each other's ideas, the participants hear each other's ideas and concerns and can interact directly. And you as the product manager, you're not the go-between, the marketeer and the sales rep, and then the architect and the UX designer and the programmer. But yeah, you bring those people together. But the idea with the key stakeholder is to invite those stakeholders whose expertise you need in order to make the right product decisions, and who need to help provide the product. So, a marketeer will have to create the marketing strategy, will have to choose the right marketing channels and create the marketing collateral. So actively contribute to the product, actively help provide the product. So that may mean that you have to explain to some of the stakeholders why they're required, why their time and energy is required in order to make the right product decisions, and that you have to explain to other stakeholders who might be interested and want to participate that as much as you appreciate their enthusiasm, their attendance of the workshop isn't really required. And as it can be challenging in some organizations to decide together and collaborate together, and as I believe the person in charge of the product should focus on leading the strategizing effort and be able to actively contribute to the strategy so that the right product decisions are being made, I would suggest that you involve a skilled facilitator, and that might be your Scrum Master or Agile coach who maybe establishes ground rules if that's necessary and reminds people of them, ensures that everybody is heard, everybody has the opportunity to speak, but nobody dominates. So there are two common mistakes I see teams make when it comes to collaborative decision making and collaborative strategizing. The first one is to kind of assume that you've got to please everybody and everybody's got to be super happy with every single decision. And then you end up either with a Frankenstein product, a product that has a really weak value proposition where it's not clear what it does and for whom it is, and has a horrible fragmented user experience. Or you then sort of look for some weak compromises and try and sort of find a common denominator. And you end up, instead of creating a horse, you end up creating a camel, right? That's what they say. A camel is a horse designed by committee. It's not very kind on the camels, but I think it gets the message across. So I think that'd be a mistake. And another mistake I see teams make when it comes to collaborative decision making is just to allow the most senior person or the most influential person in the room or simply the loudest person to take over and essentially decide, make all the decisions. But that's not right either. And so again, I think it can be very helpful to have a Scrum Master Agile coach or another facilitator here who literally facilitates and ensures that the decisions are made in the right way. Maybe also suggests a decision rule, such as unanimous agreement or consent. So unanimous agreement would mean that everybody thinks the strategic decisions that you take are solid, they're good ideas. Consent would mean that nobody has any meaningful objections. Everybody thinks that they're good enough. We can live with this, at least for now. So yeah, bring the right people together. Bring the right people together in order to create an initial strategy and then validate that strategy and then regularly review and update the strategy. And I gave this bubble here, this group of people a name and called it the product team. So different people in the product management community use the term product team in different ways, which seems to be the way for most terms in product management, I find. We seem to have a hard time as a community just to agree on one term. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. So for me, I like the term product team, and I like the idea of creating a team here, and not just a loose collection of individuals or a collection of individuals that show up for one workshop and then they're gone, and then in 3 months' time, it's a completely different group. But I think it's important to try and invite the right people and then keep this group stable so that people get to know each other and people get to trust each other. And then the whole collaboration piece, the collaborative strategizing and decision-making usually becomes much more effective and much more enjoyable. So yeah, try and keep that group stable if you can. And that's it. Oh, no, there's one more thing. Empowered. Oh, well, that's not important. We don't need to talk about empowered product people, do we? No, none of we're all super empowered. So the reason that I wanted to, the reason that I stuck empowered on here is and you've probably experienced that many times yourself, or you've experienced that yourself most likely, it's not always easy to agree in a group and find some form of consensus and reach agreement. And so if this group of people can't agree, then I believe it's useful that the person in charge of the product has the final say. So is empowered to make a strategic decision and says, look, we've discussed this now for 2 hours, or we've maybe had repeated discussions about this. We can't agree on the target group. The data is inconclusive. Therefore, I suggest for now, this is the target group that we should choose. And so this means that the person in charge of the product has what I call full stack ownership, or ultimately owns the product strategy, ultimately owns the product roadmap, and not only the product backlog or the requirement specification and the detailed tactical product decisions. So yes, that was the idea behind Empowered. And that's it really. So make sure that you have a strategy in place. It's surprising to me to discover how often product people don't have a strategy for their products. So if you don't have one, that's okay, but then it's an opportunity to make explicit who you think the users and customers are, and what the value your product creates, if there are any standout features, and what the business goals are, and also then check that with the development teams and key stakeholders. Focus your strategy on the user customer needs and the business goals. Those are the most valuable pieces of any product strategy, I would suggest. Make sure your strategy is based on empirical evidence and data, not just wishful thinking or gut feeling or the highest paid person opinion. And so that hopefully it will result in a desirable, feasible, viable, and ethical, a successful product. Think about how your strategy is connected to other product management plans, especially the vision and the product roadmap. And don't forget to regularly inspect and adapt it. And finally, create, validate, and review, update a product strategy together with the right people, development team members, and representatives. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope some of what I had to say was a little bit useful for you. You can find more information on strategy on my website, and David kindly mentioned one of the books that I've written. Picture here shows the second edition of my book, Strategize, which was published a couple of months ago. So if you want to go deeper on what I had to say, you'll find more information on Strategize. And then to finish off my talk, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about that bike trip, because I mentioned the photo I showed you was taken at the beginning of a ride I did, as I'm sure you will remember. So I think some of you, hopefully many, will be very excited to hear now what happened next, right? So, well, it was a nice ride, and so I managed to finish it, and I ended up where I started at the lake. So if anybody wants to find out more about the ride, or riding in the Bavarian Alps, and I did that on a gravel ride, which I'm not sure, on a gravel bike, so it was designed, planned as a gravel ride. I'm not sure that was the best possible strategy. Then come and talk to me either now or in one of the breaks. But if you now have any questions related to product strategy, I'll take those as well. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Roman. So again, we do have mics. We have Alison just with online questions as well. I think a couple came in, I saw.
Kick off with the online questions. The first of which being, would your OKRs impact your product strategy? I noticed it wasn't noted on the adaptive slide.
Yeah, nice question. So it's a tricky one for me to answer. Partly because I have a bias. I'm biased. And I also have to say I'm not an OKR expert. I experienced OKRs firsthand when I worked at Intel in the late 1990s, and OKRs were developed at Intel by Andy Grove in the 1970s, as far as I know. But when I worked at Intel, I didn't experience OKRs in product management, but they were used to set company, group, team, and personal objectives. And so if objectives, if OKRs are the right goal-setting technique for you, then that's brilliant. And there's nothing wrong with using OKRs in product management. Just personally, I'm not a super big fan of using OKRs in a product management context, I must admit. And one of the reasons is that I personally find when I formulate goals using OKRs, then they tend to be quite verbose and quite hard to understand. There's so much text. And I think one of the advancements we've seen in product management over the past 10 odd years is the approach of dedicated tools and templates. Think about the business model canvas created by Alexander Osterwalder, or you think about tools like the product vision board that I created or the lean canvas by Ashmoria, for instance. So, you know, for me, it's kind of nice to use dedicated tools that allow us to easily visualize information rather than, you know, a goal setting technique that I find ends up, you know, in quite lengthy, sometimes difficult to understand goals. But again, you know, that's maybe just my limited knowledge about OKRs. So you can capture your strategy using OKRs. You can capture your roadmap using OKRs. And if that works for you, again, there's nothing wrong with it. But I'm probably not the best person to ask for more advice on how exactly to do it, because my honest answer is I wouldn't do it that way. But again, I'm biased, so sorry about this.
Okay, we have a couple more online questions. The next being, what do you do when your product strategy timeline or budget changes? How do you decide what to cut, keep, or pivot on? And how do you do that without causing frustration on the product team?
Yes, nice question. So let me see if I can quickly maybe bring up a slide that helps me explain this. When it comes to budgeting decisions, and when it comes to, you could say, more delivery implementation related decisions around balancing outcomes, goals with budget and expectations around timeframes and dates, then that's not something I would necessarily do in the context of the product strategy. That's something I would do in the context of a product roadmap. And this is where the product roadmap nicely, in my mind, complements the strategy and details the strategic decisions. So if your budget, for instance, is reduced, I don't know, companies in difficulties, experiences difficulties, and now all the product budgets are being reviewed and your budget is being significantly reduced, then that would have initially an impact on the product roadmap. And I try and accommodate that change within the context of the product roadmap. And it may mean that the outcomes, the goals that you have on your roadmap, they have to be weakened, or they have to be adapted, they have to be reworked. And only if the impact to the roadmap is significant, I then sort of go back to the strategy and rework the strategy. So personally, I wouldn't make any assumptions in the strategy about timelines, and I wouldn't make any assumptions in the strategy about a budget or cost. That conversation I have in the context of a product roadmap. Yeah. So again, maybe just to explain this, I didn't state any timelines. For me, the vision is something that, I did mention that earlier, but no timeline, so it may never be fully realized. So it should last at least for five years, maybe 10 years, maybe longer. And then the product strategy, you know, that'll depend on where your product is in its life cycle and on how dynamic the market is, but it might last 12 months, 18 months, it might last a few years. But your roadmap, I would typically, for a digital product, limit to 12 months. Sometimes that's too long, and then you have to go down to 6 months or 9 months. For hardware-related products, it's not long enough sometimes, and then you have to extend it to 18 or 24 months. And then if you follow my advice and limit your product backlog to the next product goal, you then work with a product backlog that maybe focuses on the next 3 months or so. Again, in terms of timelines, in terms of budget, you know, that's a conversation I'd have, and cost within the context of the roadmap. And I'd expect then initially an impact to the roadmap, and only then, you know, in a second step, possibly an impact to the strategy.
Any questions?
Hi, Roman. I'm Ricardo Coluso from Biotas, that is an Irish company based in Limerick. And first, I would like to thank you, because just with your product vision board and the Go product roadmap, you changed the way we work, I would say, around the world in terms of product management. These are two amazing artifacts.
Oh, thank you.
So, and you mentioned about the collaborative strategy, and I wonder, I have a couple of questions and ideas, but I would like to get your take on how the idea of dual track work aligned with that. Is like, what is your experience and what are your hints for adding small activities of research and validation inside the sprint backlog or the product backlog, actually.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that question. So maybe just to briefly explain sort of what the, I guess, idea behind dual track is. Did I mention that I like bicycles and riding my bikes? So when you ride a bike, there are two things that you have to do. Sort of two types of activities. What do you have to do in order to ride your bike? Yes, thank you. So you have to pedal, yeah, move the cranks. You have to pedal, and some of you might know that the professional cyclists spend a lot of time in optimizing the way they pedal and making it as efficient as possible. And then we have to steer, we have to keep balance. We also may have to adjust the gears that we use, so we don't hurt our knees and our back. So those are all sort of the kind of tactical decisions, the right here, right now decisions that we have to make, right? But what happens if we don't look ahead? Sooner or later, we're going to crash, right? Either because we overlook an obstacle, be it, I don't know, a stone or a tree or a car, or we miss a corner or a bend. And from my own experience, I can tell you that can be painful. So, you know, it's a common challenge that we have as human beings, I would suggest, that, you know, we got to stay grounded in the right here, right now, in the moment, but at the same time, do a little bit of looking ahead. And the same needs to happen in product management. The same needs to happen with our products. We need to focus on delivery and execution, and we need to collect and listen to and analyze the feedback and the data we're collecting on the product as people use it right now. But at the same time, we have to think about what's going to happen next. You know, what's ahead, and how can we avoid crashing, and how can we have as much fun and success with our products as possible. And I think that's ultimately what gave rise to the idea of dual track and making time in order to allow people and reserving budgeting for time for development teams, so, you know, to look ahead. And, you know, if you find it helpful to put some tickets or some cards on the sprint backlog, there's nothing that's wrong with it. Technically speaking, from a Scrum perspective, it's probably not what I would do, because the tasks in the sprint backlog should be focused on the sprint goal. I'd probably work more with a budget and say like 10% of the time, or 5%, depending on how much you feel is helpful, is necessary, of the development team members is spent on research activities, on looking forward activities, on doing UX research and doing technology research, and, you know, supporting you as the person in charge of the product with those kind of activities. I'm not a big fan of dual track, by the way, as it was defined by my colleague Jeff Patton. But I very much like Jeff Patton and I respect his work, I should say.
So you do prefer to have like a separate backlog for the looking ahead?
Yes.
Okay.
And I mean, this is now turning into some kind of process nerd speak, and I'm running over, sorry. But I'd also use a different process. I'd use a Kanban board and a Kanban-based process for strategizing and discovery and research-related activities, personally. That'd be my recommendation. But no cycling questions. Yes. No, but out of time, I think.
I think we are out of time.
Right, thank you.
Thank you very much.